The end of And Just Like That was supposed to feel like coming home. Instead, it felt like leaving a party you didn't want to be at in the first place, awkward, drawn out, and strangely empty. Fans who once celebrated Carrie, Miranda, and Charlotte as bold symbols of independence and friendship were left asking a painful question. How did a show that once defined an era lose its way so badly? To understand why the ending of And Just Like That fell apart, we first need to step back and look at what came before it: Sex and the City. When the original series first aired in the late 1990s, it wasn't just another TV drama. It was a cultural earthquake. Here were four women living in New York, unapologetically talking about sex, relationships, careers, and life in a way television had never dared to show before. Carrie Bradshaw, with her typewriter tapping away late into the night, turned her love life into a column that spoke directly to millions of women around the world. At its heart, Sex and the City was about more than just fashion or romance. It was about friendship. No matter how wild the relationships got, whether Carrie was caught up with Big, Miranda was juggling her career and dating life, Charlotte was chasing the dream of marriage, or Samantha was redefining what it meant to be sexually liberated, the core of the show was always the bond between the four women. That friendship grounded everything, making the high heels, Cosmopolitans, and Manhattan nights more than just TV aesthetics. It became a reflection of modern womanhood at the time. This is important because it set an almost impossible standard. When you build a show that defines a generation, people will always expect the same spark when you return decades later. The time And Just Like That premiered, the stakes were sky high. Viewers weren't just tuning in to watch a continuation. They were looking for nostalgia, closure, and maybe even a sense of comfort. After all, the world had changed a lot since the original run. The characters had aged, society had shifted, and television itself had evolved. But audiences still wanted the heart of what made Sex and the City so iconic. And in the beginning, it almost felt like And Just Like That could deliver. The opening episodes leaned heavily on familiarity. Seeing Carrie again, walking the streets of New York, reminded fans of the magic of the late 90s and early 2000s. The show promised to explore aging, grief, and reinvention in a more mature way. It seemed poised to be both a tribute to its legacy and a bold, new chapter. But here's the problem. Nostalgia is a double-edged sword. While it can draw viewers in, it can also trap writers into recycling old ideas or leaning too hard on past glories without offering anything new. And that's where the cracks began to show. Fans were quick to notice that while the show dressed itself up in the familiar glitter of New York City, the essence, the sharp writing, the witty banter, the daring exploration of messy, complicated lives was fading. Even before the finale, there was a growing unease. Critics pointed out that the characters no longer felt like the ones we grew up with. Carrie seemed oddly hollow, Miranda's choices felt inconsistent, and Charlotte was stuck in the same old patterns. What once felt groundbreaking now seemed like it was struggling to keep up with the times. By the time the ending arrived, the weight of these problems came crashing down, leaving fans wondering if the reboot ever truly understood what made its predecessor so powerful. And that's the context we need to keep in mind. Sex and the City wasn't just a show, it was a movement. And Just Like That wasn't just a reboot, it was a return to something sacred for fans, which is exactly why its failure hurt so much. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. When And Just Like That first returned to our screens, there was a strange mix of excitement and dread. Excitement because fans were about to revisit a world they once loved, those Manhattan streets, the brunch conversations, and the familiar rhythm of Carrie's musings. But also dread, because reboots rarely survive the weight of nostalgia. Most stumble, trying to juggle old expectations with new directions. Still, the opening episodes had promise. Seeing Carrie, Miranda, and Charlotte together again was almost surreal. Their lives had moved forward, their wardrobes had evolved, and their struggles reflected a different stage of life. The creators didn't shy away from age. Carrie was no longer the single 30-something chasing love in Manhattan. She was a widow grieving Mr. Big, Miranda was wrestling with midlife dissatisfaction, questioning her marriage and career. Charlotte was living in her dream scenario family, stability, perfection, but struggling with the realities that came with it. These weren't the glamorous 20-somethings anymore. They were women in their 50s, and the show set out to explore exactly what that looked like. At first, this seemed refreshing. After all, how many shows center middle-aged women with the same depth and attention as they once did in their youth? For many viewers, the reboot was a rare chance to see how these characters had aged, changed, and adapted to the modern world. The themes were ambitious: grief, motherhood, gender identity, shifting sexual dynamics, even the discomfort of trying to stay relevant in a culture that moves faster than ever, and for a brief moment, fans thought the show might just succeed. Carrie's grief arc, for example, had real weight. Watching her try to navigate life after Big's death gave the story a sense of gravity the original series rarely touched. Miranda's restless energy felt believable at first. After years of building a career, of raising a child, maybe she really was yearning for something new. Even Charlotte's perfectionist tendencies hit familiar notes, reminding audiences of the character they had always known. But here's where the build-up began to falter: the execution. Instead of letting these themes breathe, the show seemed desperate to prove it was modern, progressive, and in touch. Scenes often felt like they were written to tick boxes rather than tell organic stories. Miranda's sudden dive into a completely new identity didn't feel like evolution, it felt like a rewrite. Carrie's grief, while strong in the beginning, quickly turned into awkward comedic beats that undercut the seriousness of her loss. Charlotte's struggles, rather than being nuanced, often came across as cartoonish exaggerations of her character's past. And then there was the absence of Samantha. Her presence, or rather the lack of it, cast a long shadow over the reboot. The chemistry of the original foursome had always been the heartbeat of the series. With only 3 women left, every interaction felt just a little emptier. The writers tried to paper over this gap with references, text messages, and off-screen nods, but fans knew something was missing. The sparkle, the boldness, the unfiltered energy that Samantha brought was gone. Despite these cracks, audiences kept watching. Because that's the power of nostalgia. Even when the execution is shaky, the memory of what once was keeps viewers hooked. People wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, the show would find its rhythm again. They wanted to see Carrie rediscover herself, Miranda redefine her path in a way that felt authentic, Charlotte face her fears of imperfection, and perhaps, just perhaps, get the kind of storytelling closure the original series and movies never fully delivered. The build-up, then, was full of promise. It dangled threads of deep, meaningful exploration: aging, reinvention, grief, friendship. It reminded fans of the emotional highs the original once gave them. But at the same time, it set up expectations that the show never intended, or perhaps never knew how to pay off. And that is the tragedy of And Just Like That. The reboot began with the potential to be a rare second act for beloved characters. But instead, it laid the groundwork for disappointment by mistaking surface-level change for true storytelling growth. By the time the finale of And Just Like That arrived, fans were holding on to hope. After all, even shows that stumble in the middle sometimes redeem themselves with a strong closing chapter. But instead of redemption, the ending exposed every weakness the reboot had been hiding under its glossy Manhattan skyline. It didn't just fumble, it unraveled. The first problem was emotional payoff, or the lack of it. A finale is meant to bring closure, to tie up the threads that have been woven throughout the season. But here, most arcs felt abandoned halfway through. Carrie's grief, which started with genuine weight, was reduced to a strange subplot about scattering Big's ashes in Paris. The emotional depth of losing the love of her life was boiled down to a symbolic trip that felt rushed and oddly hollow. What should have been a cathartic moment, the true goodbye, landed flat, because the show never committed to exploring her pain beyond surface-level gestures. Instead of offering insight into how Carrie had grown, the finale seemed content to place her back in familiar, safe territory. As if nothing had truly changed, then there was Miranda's storyline, which became one of the most polarizing elements of the reboot. Her sudden affair, her decision to abandon a long-established marriage, her dive into a brand-new identity, all of it might have worked if the show had given her journey time, nuance, and consistency. But by the finale, Miranda's choices felt more like plot devices than character development. Her decision to leave everything behind for a whirlwind. Romance wasn't framed as liberation or discovery, it was framed as impulse. The Miranda we knew from the original series was sharp, analytical, and pragmatic. The Miranda of the reboot was unrecognizable, making rash decisions. With little reflection, the ending didn't resolve her contradictions. It amplified them. Charlotte's arc was equally unsatisfying, though in a quieter way. Her entire presence in the reboot seemed to hover on the edge of comedy and caricature. While she had real struggles navigating parenthood, grappling with shifting family dynamics, the finale didn't offer her growth, only repetition. She remained locked in the same loop of perfectionism and social appearances, a character who had the chance to break free from her old patterns but never did. Instead of evolving, she was reduced to comic relief in a story that desperately needed more grounded emotion, and then came the tone problem. Sex and the City was always witty, daring, and at times outrageous, but it knew when to slow down and let emotions breathe. And just like that, especially in its final stretch, couldn't find its balance. One moment, it aimed for heartfelt drama. The next, it stumbled into awkward humor that undercut the tension. The ending tried to be both nostalgic and progressive, heartfelt and funny, reflective and forward-looking. But instead of blending these tones seamlessly, it clashed them together, leaving a finale that felt scattered, uncertain and strangely unfinished. The pacing only made things worse. Somehow, the finale managed to feel both rushed and dragged out at the same time. Key resolutions were delivered in hurried conversations, while less important moments were stretched far beyond their weight. It gave the impression that the writers were more interested in setting up potential for another season than in actually closing the one they had. And that's the danger of modern television. When every finale feels like a placeholder instead of a true ending, the audience leaves dissatisfied, but perhaps the deepest flaw was the disconnect from the show's DNA. The original Sex and the City knew its identity. It was bold, sharp, and unapologetically about women navigating love and friendship in a modern city. The reboot's finale, however, felt like it had lost sight of that compass. Instead of celebrating friendship, the core of the story, it scattered the characters into isolated arcs that rarely connected in meaningful ways. Instead of bold choices, it gave safe resolutions disguised as risk-taking. And instead of honoring the growth of its characters, it reset them back to empty versions of themselves. This is why fans left the finale feeling hollow. It wasn't just that the storylines were weak or the pacing clumsy, it was that the show had forgotten what made these characters matter in the first place. The ending wasn't a closing chapter. It was a mirror, reflecting back just how far, and just like that, had drifted from the brilliance of its origins. Asterisk when the credits rolled on the final episode of And Just Like That, there was silence, but not the kind the writers had hoped for. It wasn't the silence of awe or reflection. It was the silence of disappointment, quickly broken by the sound of keyboards. Within minutes, social media platforms lit up with reactions, reviews, and memes, many of them sharp, many of them brutal. Fans who had once lined up in excitement for every Sex and the City episode now took to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok to express how hollow they felt. The backlash wasn't quiet or niche, it was loud, widespread, and relentless. On fan forums, long threads dissected every choice, from the mishandling of Carrie's grief to the complete rewriting of Miranda's character. Critics joined in, publishing headlines that ranged from "the show that forgot its own characters" to "a finale that rings empty." Entertainment magazines that had once praised Sex and the City as groundbreaking now described its reboot as out of touch and tone-deaf. It was clear the finale had not just missed the mark, it had ignited frustration. What stung the most for longtime viewers was the sense of betrayal. These were characters fans had grown up with. They had celebrated their victories, mourned their heartbreaks, and in many ways lived alongside them for decades. But the finale seemed to treat those connections carelessly, as though decades of loyalty could be brushed aside with rushed resolutions and shallow payoffs. Fans weren't simply angry at the writing, they were heartbroken. For them, it felt like saying goodbye to old friends, only to realize those friends had been rewritten into strangers. Miranda's storyline, in particular, became a lightning rod for criticism. For some, her journey into new love and new identity could have been a powerful evolution. But the way it was written felt so rushed and inconsistent that it alienated viewers who once admired her razor-sharp pragmatism. The Miranda they remembered, logical, thoughtful, grounded, was gone, replaced by someone impulsive and almost unrecognizable. Many fans labeled this change not as growth but as a betrayal of her legacy. Carrie's arc fared no better. Instead of watching her emerge stronger from loss, fans saw her retreat into recycled patterns. Critics noted that her trip to Paris to scatter Big's ashes should have been profound, but it felt oddly performative, as though the show was more interested in recreating iconic imagery than exploring real healing. The sense of closure audiences craved was replaced by the sense that nothing had changed at all. Charlotte's role drew a quieter but persistent critique. For all her screen time, her journey felt like filler, a repetition of old quirks without any meaningful resolution. Fans felt robbed of the chance to see her finally confront her perfectionism with depth. Instead, she became a supporting act in a story that was supposed to showcase her growth alongside Carrie and Miranda across social platforms. One phrase appeared again and again: "This doesn't feel like them." And that was the crux of the backlash. Viewers didn't just dislike the ending, they felt disconnected from it. They felt as though the writers had forgotten who these women were, and in doing so, forgotten who the audience was. Even entertainment critics, who often extend grace to ambitious but flawed shows, couldn't overlook the missteps. Some praised the reboot for daring to touch on grief, aging, and identity, but almost all agreed the execution lacked authenticity. Reviews described the finale as confused, unfinished, and a placeholder rather than an ending. The harshest critics declared that the show had damaged its own legacy, and yet, buried in the backlash was a glimmer of something more complicated: longing. Fans were angry, yes, but also sad that this was the goodbye they had been given. Many admitted they kept watching despite their frustrations, simply because of what the original series had meant to them. Nostalgia kept them invested, even when the story didn't. That's the double-edged sword of cultural icons. The audience will always show up. But if you fail them, their disappointment cuts twice as deep. In the end, the backlash to and just. Like that wasn't just about one bad finale. It was about broken trust. For decades, Sex and the City had been a mirror, sometimes glamorous, sometimes messy, but always honest about its characters' journeys. The reboot's finale shattered that mirror, leaving fans staring at a distorted reflection of something they once loved. And the response was clear. Audiences weren't just dissatisfied, they were grieving the loss of what the show used to be.